Now, as world powers continue to debate what caused the crash of Ukraine Airlines Flight 752, we're going to focus on the human cost of the incident by looking at the life of one of the 176 people on board. غنیمت Azhdari was a 36-year-old PhD student who hailed from a nomadic tribe in southwest Iran. Her doctorate focused on the role indigenous cultures can play in preserving the biodiversity of the places they live. Here she is explaining her work for the indigenous rights group ICCA.
We are indigenous nomadic peoples, and for thousands of years we are living in our biodiverse area with conserving all the aspects of our territories and all the assets that we have in our territories. Rivers, mountains, lakes, grazing areas, rangelands, forests, springs and sacred sites.
Well, غنیمت Azhdari was on her way to Canada to continue work on her doctorate thesis when she boarded Ukraine International Airlines Flight 572 out of Tehran. She was among the 176 people who died when the plane crashed. I'm joined now by her PhD tutor at Guelph University in Ontario, Dr. Faisal Muller. Doctor, thanks so much for coming on at such a difficult time. When did you first hear about this tragedy and, of course, her untimely death?
Well, it was particularly tragic because غنیمت and I had actually been corresponding by email just upon her arrival at the airport. And when I woke up in the morning, I actually was reading her emails and then subsequently around the same time received a text from one of her colleagues in Tehran that in fact there had been a terrible accident and that in fact she had perished on this flight.
Just tell us a bit about how you worked with her and what was the nature of the work she was doing.
Yes, غنیمت was a remarkable person. She was an indigenous person in Iran from a nomadic tribal community in southwestern Iran. And غنیمت and I had been working for about a year and a half on research meant to help advance the rights of indigenous peoples for the protection of their ancestral territories. She formally joined the University of Guelph in September, and we had begun some work in the identification of the biocultural values of indigenous landscapes in northern Canada. And she was returning to the lab, and shortly we were actually going to begin some of our field work with some of the indigenous nations in Canada, based on the approaches that she had used so successfully with her own indigenous nations in Iran.
You've described her there as a scholar and an academic, and quite brilliant at both.
Yes, you know, غنیمت was somebody who could slip very seamlessly between two worlds. As an indigenous person, she had a very strong connection to the land and to the plants and the animals and to the source of her culture and her spirituality. She was also a very effective person in international policy contexts and also as a scientist. And she was so effective in terms of using the biocultural conservation, the biocultural rationale of indigenous peoples to advance new systems of conservation governance at both the domestic scale and also the international scale as well.
Clearly very talented. What will you remember about her as a person?
غنیمت, you know, was not a very big person. She was probably a little bit over 5 foot in size, but she had this remarkable ability to command people's attention. It was not just because of her technical knowledge in science and policy, but also her very strong personal narrative as an indigenous person from Iran, as somebody who had such a remarkable connection to the biodiversity of the planet and who was working so hard to see the expansion of the protection of nature around the world.
And how are the university and obviously friends and colleagues going to cope, do you think?
Well, it's been a very difficult time at the university. When we heard that غنیمت had died, there's also a second PhD student at the University of Guelph that's died. We've also heard that there are, in fact, well over 24 other graduate students and undergraduate students all across Canada at various universities. The first thing we did was we had crisis counselors and grief counselors meeting with our students. There's going to be a vigil for غنیمت this evening at the University of Guelph, really to celebrate her remarkable life that was cut so short, so quickly.
Yeah, it's such a difficult time. We really appreciate you coming on, remembering the life there of غنیمت and talking about how you're going to remember her in the future. Dr. Faisal Mullah there in Toronto, thank you so much for joining us.
All the best.